સંધાન ઓલ ગુજરાત ઇન્ટિગ્રેટેડ ક્લાસરૂમ
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good morning, friends. My name is Sachin Ketkar and I work at the MS University of Baroda, and today we are going to look at some of the basics of metaphysical poetry. What I am going to do today is I am going to look at various aspects of metaphysical poetry, and I am also going to keep the poems that are very commonly discussed and prescribed in our syllabus in mind while doing this discussion on metaphysical poetry. So let us start our discussion on the metaphysical poetry. So let us look at what is the intention today of today's presentation. So let's look at the first slide here, and what are the objectives of today's presentation. The first objective is to familiarize students with essential aspects, poets and critics of metaphysical poetry. To familiarize students with some basic features and characteristics of metaphysical poetry, like the metaphysical conceit. And to acquaint students with the pervasive impact of the metaphysical poetry on modern poetry and contemporary poetry. And in doing so, we are going to discuss some of the poems that are prescribed in your syllabus. So let's begin. So when we hear the term metaphysical poetry, the first thing that comes to our mind is, what do we mean by metaphysical poetry? Now, if you look at the term metaphysical closely, then the term metaphysical stands for knowledge about something which lies beyond the domain of physical, and that the term metaphysics is found in Aristotle's philosophy, where he talks about things which lie beyond the domain of physical. So the metaphysical questions would include questions like, what do we mean by God, or who created this universe, or how will this universe end, or what is death. So these are some of the questions under metaphysics. But while we study literature, it is not in this sense that we understand the term metaphysical poetry. In fact, the term metaphysical poets is given to the poets in the 17th century England who are inclined to personal and intellectual complexity and concentration that is displayed in the poetry of John Donne, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, John Cleveland, Abraham Cowley, George Herbert, and Richard Crashaw. These are some of the poets who can be considered as belonging to the school of metaphysical poetry. What is important for us, that all of us seem to follow John Donne as their master in writing poetry, in the style, in the techniques that they use in writing poetry. So let's look at John Donne and his poetry in greater detail. John Donne was the most influential metaphysical poet, and he was born in 1572 and died in 1631. So you can say that he was one of the younger contemporaries of William Shakespeare. What is important for us to keep in mind, that in some way John Donne belongs to both Elizabethan period and something which can be called as post-Elizabethan period. And that's primarily because in some way his poetry belongs to Elizabethan poetry. At the same time, it involves rejection of the established poetic idiom of Elizabethan period. In some way he dissented from poetics, the style, the techniques of writing which Elizabethan poets followed. And because of this kind of rebellious way of writing poetry, John Donne's poetry was not published when he was alive. In fact, it was circulated as a manuscript among people who loved poetry. And he had a small number of poetry lovers who followed him. So he became almost like a guru to a group of poets who actually fell apart from the common established idiom of Elizabethan poetry. And we will look into this in greater detail when we start analyzing metaphysical poetry and the various aspects. So let's move ahead and look at the next slide here. Very interestingly, the term metaphysical was used in a negative sense, in a critical sense, by most of the contemporaries of Elizabethan times. Most interesting is the Scottish poet William Drummond, who used the term metaphysical in a pejorative sense and objected to those of his contemporaries who attempted to abstract poetry to metaphysical ideas and scholastic quiddities. William Drummond is attacking and writing bitterly about John Donne and his followers for abstraction and intellectualism that seems to be so very important to metaphysical poetry. But William Drummond was not the only one who criticized the metaphysicals. Among others was a very well-known critic and a poet named John Dryden, who is also called the father of English criticism. And he was extremely annoyed with John Donne's school of poetry. So the term metaphysical is used by these poets in a negative sense. Let's look at what John Dryden has to say about John Donne. He says, John Donne affects metaphysics not only in his satires but in his amorous verses, where nature should reign, and perplexes the mind of fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts and entertain them with softness of love. John Donne is complaining against excessive intellectuality and tendency to philosophize that is found in John Donne's erotic and love poetry. Actually, what Dryden is complaining about is the idea that poetry should be limited to feelings and emotions and not to intellect, not to scholarship, not to philosophy. And this complaint seems to persist a great deal. Another very major critic who was extremely harsh on metaphysical poets and the whole school of metaphysical poets is a person named Samuel Johnson. And Samuel Johnson is a very famous critic, and his words were taken as authority in those days. So let's see what Samuel Johnson has to say about the metaphysical poets. Samuel Johnson says the metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their endeavor. They neither copied nature nor life, neither painted the forms of matter, nor represented the operations of intellect. They were careless in their diction. And Samuel Johnson is writing this in his very famous book called Life of Cowley. And Abraham Cowley was a very famous metaphysical poet, and Samuel Johnson is critical of a whole school of metaphysical poets. And this is Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson, 1709 to 1784, often referred to as Dr. Johnson, was an English writer who made lasting contribution to English literature as a poet, essayist, moralist, literary critic, biographer, editor, and lexicographer. And when such negative criticism comes from such a big authority, metaphysical poetry was sidetracked in its own time. People did not take it very seriously. In fact, it was hardly published. Most of it was circulated in a manuscript form among a small group of poetry lovers and readers, and the practitioners of the poetry themselves. So you can say that metaphysical poetry was largely marginal to its period. It was never central. But as the time progressed, metaphysical poetry gained in eminence. And by the time we reached 20th century, in 1930s and 40s, largely because of T.S. Eliot's influential essay, The Metaphysical Poets, in 1921, which is a review of Herbert J.C. Grierson's anthology called Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. Largely because of this essay, the reputation of metaphysical poets in contemporary times was established. However, we will be looking at T.S. Eliot and what he has to say about metaphysical poetry in greater detail towards the end of our presentation, because what he says is very important for us to understand when we are reading metaphysical poetry. Now, this is the cover of the book Metaphysical Poetry Done to Butler, written by Sir Herbert John Clifford Grierson, 1866 to 1960. Often referred to as Herbert J.C. Grierson, was a Scottish literary scholar, editor, and literary critic. He is credited with promoting interest in metaphysical poets, especially John Donne, in the beginning of 20th century. It is this book that T.S. Eliot later on reviews in 1921, and which establishes metaphysical poetry as a very important school, a very important movement in poetry. And this is a picture of T.S. Eliot. Thomas Turn Eliot, 26 September 1888 to 4 January 1965, was an essayist, publisher, playwright, social critic, and one of the most important 20th century poets, probably one of the most influential poets and critics of 20th century. And in his discussion of metaphysical poetry, you can see almost his own theory and practice of poetry emerging. So we'll look at all these aspects in greater detail in the course of our discussion. So let's go back to metaphysical poets. What T.S. Eliot is doing in this essay is that he is arguing that very things, very characteristics, the very features of metaphysical poetry which are seen as drawback or shortcoming or limitation of metaphysical poetry. And those shortcomings would be something like excessive intellectual complexity, extreme imagery, and very far-fetched analogies and comparison is in fact the strength of metaphysical poetry. And it is this poetic practice, this poetics, this style, this technique of writing which brings metaphysical poets and poetry closer to 20th century poetry. So what is weakness in the eyes of Johnson, Dryden, and Drummond is the strength for Eliot. Now this is very interesting. So what is evaluated as inferior or marginal by the contemporaries is seen as something which is extremely significant and critical to evolution of poetry by the later poets and practitioners and critics. So very often what seems to happen is the evaluation of poetry or literature by contemporaries is not always the most accurate one. Very often it is the time which seems to be the most important critic. So let's look at metaphysical poetry. As we have said, metaphysical poetry is poetry of a group of poets who followed John Donne in the beginning of 17th century. That is something like 1600 onwards. And this group of poets included people like George Herbert, some of his poems you are studying, Andrew Marvell, whose poems you might have studied, and people like Cowley, Vaughan, and Crashaw. So what are some of the most important characteristics, features of metaphysical poetry? And one of the chief features of the metaphysical poetry is ample use of conceits. Now conceits is a device, is a technique, is a literary device, a poetic device which is a kind of extended metaphor. It's a kind of long comparison, an analogy which seems to run not just in couple of lines but also through the whole passage or even whole poem. The entire poem seems to be a kind of extension of a single analogy, a single comparison. And very often this comparison is supported by very far-fetched similes and metaphors and images. Now this is typical of metaphysical poetry, and we'll look at examples of these conceits. But conceits are found in poems which are not just metaphysical. In many other kinds of poems you will find conceits. So what is so special about metaphysical conceit? So if you look at the slide, then a conceit is an extended metaphor with a complex logic that governs a poetic passage or entire poem. It's more on a logical argument, a thesis supported by far-fetched analogies. The metaphysical conceit is very often contrasted with Petrarchan conceit, which was typical feature of Elizabethan lyrical poetry. So metaphysical conceit can be contrasted, can be understood as being very different from the poetic idiom of Elizabethan poetry. Elizabethan poetry is characterized by what is known as Petrarchan conceit. So let us understand first what is Petrarchan conceit and how is metaphysical conceit different from Petrarchan conceit. And if we understand the difference, then we understand the difference between Elizabethan poetry and metaphysical poetry. So let us look at Petrarchan conceit. So the slide says the Petrarchan conceit is a type of metaphor used in love poems written by the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch, but became cliched in some of his later Elizabethan imitators. As you might have studied in your literary history about some of the most important characteristics of Elizabethan literature, then the influence of Petrarch is one of the significant traits of Elizabethan literature. And you might have also heard Petrarchan sonnet and Petrarchan lyric. So let us look at Petrarchan conceit. For example, the despairing lover in a ship on a stormy sea is a typical Petrarchan conceit. Or a lady's eyes shine like stars, her lips are red as coral, her breast and her forehead are as white as snow, and so on and so forth. So if you look at these comparisons between lover and various parts of lover's body, then you will find that these comparisons are very cliched. By cliche, it means they are overused. Almost every poet seems to write about this comparison. They seem to use these metaphors and similes. So these are commonplaces. These are stereotypical comparisons. And that is what happened to Elizabethan poetry. It became more and more sentimental. It became more and more stereotyped. It became more and more cliched. And that is one of the chief reasons why the Elizabethan poets were dissatisfied with the times. And that gave rise to metaphysical poetry, which can be seen as in some way a kind of rebellion against the Elizabethan idiom. And when you rebel an established practice, there is always a risk of being marginal, being sidetracked by your contemporary. So something similar happened in the case of Elizabethan period and metaphysical poetry. So now let's look at the metaphysical conceit. So how is it different from Petrarchan? So let's look at the next slide. The metaphysical conceit, in Samuel Johnson's words, and Samuel Johnson here is describing what is metaphysical conceit, and he is doing it in a negative sense, to criticize, to attack metaphysical poetry. But in doing so, what he is doing, he is giving us a very excellent description and account of what metaphysical poetry is. So he says metaphysical conceit is a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. So what he is saying here is there is a discovery of resemblance which is not physical but something like occult. something like secret, something esoteric, something hidden resemblances in the things which are not alike in any way. So there are far-fetched comparisons, and when you compare two things, there is a ground of similarity, and this similarity is, for Johnson, a kind of occult similarity. And then he goes on to say, then the most heterogeneous ideas. By heterogeneous, it means ideas from various sources, ideas not strictly from domain of poetry, but also ideas from philosophy, ideas from scholasticism, ideas from theological scholars, ideas from science, ideas from medical science, and so on. All these ideas from sources which are not strictly poetic. So that's what he means by saying heterogeneous ideas. And then he goes on to say, let's look at the definition on the slide. Heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. That means the poets do violence to ideas from various sources, and they put them together violently, yoked. Nature and art are ransacked for comparisons, for illustrations and allusions. So that is what metaphysical poets do. They bring together ideas from multiple sources which are not strictly literary, and then establish strange occult resemblances among things which are seen as not similar. So what we are going to do now is going to look at various examples of metaphysical conceits in metaphysical poetry, and then we'll go on to discuss how pervasive is the influence of metaphysical conceit on the later development of English poetry. We'll limit ourselves to 20th century poetry, and then we'll take a kind of metaphysical jump, and we'll look at how contemporary Indian poems, especially a poem by A.K. Ramanujan, Small Scale Reflection on Big House, uses some of the devices like the metaphysical conceit for his own purpose, and how he does it. So that is what we are going to do in the course of our discussion now. So let's move ahead and let us look at various examples of metaphysical conceits. This is a very famous example. This poem is a poem called The Flea by John Donne. In this poem, Donne, the speaker of the poem, talks about a flea that bites both the speaker and his lover. And it becomes a conceit, it becomes a metaphor. And he argues that his lover has no reason to deny him sexually, though they are not married. And that is because, he says, "Oh, stay, 3 lives in one flea spare. We are almost, yea, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is." What the speaker in the poem seems to imply is that because the flea has bitten both the speaker and his beloved, the blood of the lover and his beloved are united in the body of flea. So in flea's blood, you find union of 2 bloods, the lover and his beloved. Now comparing this, the whole idea is what is called conceit. And the whole poem goes on to argue and discuss how it is a very good idea for his beloved not to deny him sexually, to accept his sexual advances or sexual proposal, because their blood is already one in the body of flea. So this comparison between flea and sexual advance, and the whole logic which Donne seems to be using, seems to be a very non-Elizabethan one. He seems to be making fun of the whole idea of romantic love by evoking the image of flea. And the whole poem is a kind of extended argument. It's almost like a kind of persuasive logic that Donne is using, where the speaker is trying to seduce probably his beloved to have sex with him. So we'll look at some similar kind of metaphysical conceits later on. Let's look at the next poem by John Donne, which is not an erotic one. It's not a sexual, it's not a poem about sexual love, but it's about spirituality. So whether Donne is writing about sexual love or whether he is writing about spirituality, he is using same literary poetic device called a metaphysical conceit. So how is this device used? In a very famous sonnet which you are probably studying in your syllabus, Death Be Not Proud. John Donne personifies death as a living being, which is paradoxical because death is an occurrence, is a phenomena which happens, and Donne is personifying it as if it's a living being, and the speaker is telling it not to be vain and proud, as the people it kills do not die but wake eternally after death. The sonnet ends paradoxically as the speaker tells death that it shall die because it is a long sleep after which people actually wake up. So death is something like a living being, and in the end the sonnet ends by the speaker telling death that death, you will die. People won't die because of death. Now that is paradoxical because our common understanding of death is that human beings die. But the speaker says it's the death which will die, because death for the speaker is something like sleep, and after sleep you wake up more refreshed. So death is actually a kind of portal, a gateway to eternal life in this John Donne's poem. So what is the Christian idea behind this extended metaphysical conceit? So let's look at the next slide where we can see what is the Christian theological, philosophical basis of this metaphysical conceit. So let's look at the next slide. This poem focuses on the key paradox of Christian doctrine. Central to the believer's religious awakening is realization of his mortality, the fear of death. But ultimately, the hope of resurrection makes death lose its sting. All of us know that the ideas of death and what happens after death are different in Christianity and Hinduism. In Christianity, after death, the person's soul is summoned in front of God on the day of judgment and sent either to heaven or to hell. And there is no rebirth in Christianity. So after death, there is eternal waking up in Christianity. And that's why the speaker in the poem, Death Be Not Proud, says, he tells death not to be proud because it is death which is going to die. This extended paradoxical comparison between death and living being can be considered as an example of metaphysical conceit. And this technique, this device, became extremely popular among the followers of John Donne. So let's look at some of the followers of John Donne who use this conceit and who are considered to belong to the school of metaphysical poets. This is another example of metaphysical conceit in a poem called The Pulley by George Herbert, which you are studying in your syllabus. And all of us know that pulley is a rope, is a kind of mechanism with which you pick up heavy load using ropes and wheels. It's a mechanical device, mechanical contraption. But the poet seems to be using this whole idea of a very mechanical contraption for his poetic and spiritual purposes. How he does that? Let's look at the poem The Pulley by George Herbert. The entire poem doesn't anywhere talk about the pulley, but the last stanza reveals the conceit very indirectly. The stanza says, "Yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, and that at least, if goodness may lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast." This poem, as you are aware, talks about how God poured one gift after another on man. God poured all kind of knowledge, skills, abilities, all riches, all pleasures, all luxuries of this world on man. But finally he reserves one thing for himself, and that is rest. He did not give man rest because God believes that even if human being does not turn to God because of inherent goodness, he will definitely turn to God out of restlessness, and this restlessness will lead man to God. So the whole image of restlessness is when it is compared to a rope on a wheel that pulls man back to God's breast, is what pulley is all about. So if you look at this comparison between mechanical device and God's will, then these two are very far-fetched. One is very physical, mundane, day to day, while other is a very theological, religious, spiritual idea. Now how he compares these two things throughout the poem without anywhere mentioning pulley is a very good example of metaphysical conceit. Pulleys are mechanical devices, as we know, aimed at assisting us with moving heavy loads through a system of ropes and wheels to gain advantage. This is the picture of George Herbert, 3rd April 1593 to 1st March 1633. Was a Welsh-born English poet, orator, and Anglican priest. He is a very important metaphysical poet. So the metaphysical conceit in the pulley is God has blessed man everything, but did not give him blessing of rest, as we have seen. As our restlessness drags us down, it at the end of the day, when we are exhausted and still we are restless, we think of God. So God reserves this blessing of rest. So the religious notion is conveyed through a secular scientific metaphor that requires readers' acquaintance with mechanical device, and that is what metaphysical conceit is all about. However, metaphysical conceit is not the only technique that metaphysical poets use. So we'll look at something else. So look at this slide and you can see that this is a copy of a poem called Easter Wing by George Herbert. It is a pattern poem in which the work is not only meant to be read, but its shape, the shape of words on the page, the way stanzas are printed, way the lines are printed on the page, are meant to be appreciated. In this case, the poem was printed on two facing pages of a book, sideways. So the line which separates first stanza from the second is, you can see it as dividing a page in two parts of a book. So what happens here is the poem is about Easter wings, but the shape of the poem printed on the page also looks like wings. So you can see that this looks like wings of birds. So when you just look at the shape of the poem without reading it, you can make out that it is about a bird, and these are two wings of bird. So the title Easter Wings. What is interesting to note here, that this kind of experimentation with how poems look on a printed page is also a very interesting feature of metaphysical poets, especially George Herbert. And this can be seen as one of the earliest experiments in what is known as concrete poetry. In modern times, concrete poetry is poetry which is printed on a page, it has certain meaning attached to it. How the poem appears on the page has got a semantic content, and very often the meaning of the poem lies in the shape of the way words are printed on the paper. So this is another kind of experimentation of metaphysical poets. Now let's look at another example of metaphysical experimentation and metaphysical conceit. So the next slide is a very famous poem by Andrew Marvell, and it is called To His Coy Mistress. Marvell wrote this poem in classical tradition of a Latin love elegy in which the speaker praises his mistress or lover through the motif of what is known as carpe diem, or seize the day. The speaker begins by building up a thorough and elaborate conceit of many things that he would do if only the lovers had infinite amount of time at their disposal. And the poem goes on having a lot of far-fetched comparisons, exaggerations and hyperboles. So let's look at some of these exaggerations where the speaker talks about what would happen if the lovers infinite amount of time, unlimited time at their disposal. So let's look at the next slide. And this is the picture of Andrew Marvell, a very famous metaphysical poet. March 1621 to 1678 was an English metaphysical poet, a politician who sat in the House of Commons at various times between 1659 and 1678. You might have studied some poems by Marvell in your syllabus. And what is interesting to note is when John Milton, his younger poet, was arrested, it was Andrew Marvell who actually bailed him out and released him. And so it's very interesting how two very different poets bond up. But let's look at the poem To His Coy Mistress. This is a stanza from the poem, which is an example of metaphysical conceit. And if you read these lines, then the speaker is talking, he is telling his beloved that if they had infinite time and 100 years would go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, an age at least to every part, and the last age would show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. So the exaggeration, the hyperbole here is 100 years to praise each eyes is what the speaker will spend in trying to praise, in his attempt and his effort to praise his beloved. And he will spend 200 to adore each breast, 30,000 to the rest, and an age to every part. So this is a very good example of metaphysical exaggeration. The conceit which seems to be running through this poem is that that time which is supposed to eat us up, time which is always limited, time which is always finite, finally it eats up everybody. But look at how the poem ends. Now let us sport while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in this slow chap power. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we can make him run. That's how the poem ends. So the paradox here is that though time is limited and finite and very little and insufficient, it's love which can make it infinite, and how the experience of making love seems to make time vanish. So that's the paradox, and the entire poem is built around this paradox, this extended analogy, extended comparison, using a lot of hyperboles and a lot of exaggerations. Is a typical example of metaphysical poem. So let's look at the next example here. So if you have seen some of the themes of metaphysical poetry, then the poem of the theme of the poem The Flea by John Donne is erotic, is love, is physical love. And the theme of his poem Death Be Not Proud is spiritual and Christian. Andrew Marvell's poem To His Coy Mistress is an erotic poem, a love poem, and Herbert's Pulley is a spiritual and religious poem. So you can see that metaphysical poetry deals with varied themes: erotic, philosophical, religious, spiritual, and the manner in which they deal with this theme is very complex, witty, striking, and full of humor and wit. So there is a wide range of themes that metaphysical poetry handles. It's not limited just to only love poetry or spiritual poetry. So let's look at the next slide here. Now we come back to 20th century. And why is this poetry important for us to study? Why is it prescribed in your syllabus? And what is its importance? Then for that, one of the persons who established the reputation and importance of metaphysical poetry for modern readers is T.S. Eliot, as we have seen in the beginning of our presentation. And what is so important about metaphysical poetry? Let's see. And in the famous essay that we have mentioned in our earlier part of the presentation, Metaphysical Poets, published in 1921, what does he say? And what he says is very interesting. T.S. Eliot observes that in this poem, thinking and feeling, philosophizing and reflecting are not distinct modes. Usually we talk of thinking and feeling, or philosophizing and emotions, as being distinct psychological activities. But in metaphysical poetry, T.S. Eliot argues that there is no conflict between emotions, moods and feelings on one hand, and thoughts, philosophical, rational and logical, on the other. Eliot says a thought to John Donne was an experience. It modified his sensibility, his mood. So moods, feelings, emotions on one hand, and thinking and logical, rational thinking on other are not two distinct modes for John Donne, according to T.S. Eliot. In fact, these two different modes are unified in the poet's sensibility. Eliot goes on, this is picture of T.S. Eliot, and his criticism of metaphysical poets is one of the most important factors behind influence of metaphysical poetry on modern poetry. So this is picture of Eliot in his later period. The metaphysical poets, according to Eliot, possessed a mechanism of sensibility which could devour any kind of experience. Eliot is arguing that metaphysical poets have a special gift, a faculty, a special kind of psychological makeup in which thinking and feeling are not two distinctive operations, but they are done simultaneously, and they could devour, eat entire range of a human experience. So his poetry of John Donne is both intellectual and emotional at the same time. That's what Eliot is arguing. And Eliot goes on to then explain about how mind of any poet works. And he says, when a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating disparate experiences. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular, fragmentary. The latter falls in love or reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other, or with the noise of the typewriter or the smell of cooking. In the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming new wholes. What T.S. Eliot is pointing out, that how mind of poet works is different from how mind of an ordinary person works. When ordinary person reads philosophy, Spinoza, or he thinks about his lover, or he looks at his watch, or he looks at something which is being cooked, all these things are distinct. They are different from each other, and ordinary person's mind is full of chaotic impressions from various parts of his life. But for a poet's mind works in a different way. It's amalgamating. It brings together various experiences, whether it's that of reading Spinoza, the very famous philosopher, or thinking about his lover, or listening to typewriter in the background. All these experiences come together in poet's mind in a new form of amalgamation, and they are always forming new wholes, new forms in poet's mind. So this is how, according to Eliot, poet's mind is different from ordinary person's mind, and how that works. However, what happened in the course of evolution of English poetry, according to T.S. Eliot, is there was something that went wrong. He says, in later poetry after metaphysical poetry, there is feeling and thinking and experiences, but there is no union of these things. Poets after Milton and Dryden, they think and feel, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as odor of rose. The experience of smelling a rose and thinking are two distinctive activities for poets after Milton and Dryden. That's what he is saying. In 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in, from which we have never recovered. And this dissociation as in natural, was aggravated by the influence of the two most powerful poets of the century, the 17th century, Milton and Dryden. So what T.S. Eliot seems to be arguing, that poets' mind started working in a different way after the great impact of poets like Dryden and Milton, who were very powerful poets. What happened was people started thinking and feeling as seeing these two things as disparate activities which can never come together. So throughout the course of English history, you can see that feelings, emotions and moods are broken away from thinking and rationalizing. So most of the romantic poetry you can see is poetry of feelings and emotions, and as if they are trying to do away with philosophizing. But that never happens. But this kind of cracks develop in sensibility, and he accuses Milton and Dryden for doing this damage. However, Eliot adds, our civilization today, that is our life today, comprehends great variety and complexity. And this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various complex results. The poets must become more and more comprehensive, more and more elusive, more indirect, in order to force, to dislocate if necessary, language into its meaning. So today's life is very complex according to Eliot, and there is a complex range of emotions and feelings and experiences that human beings have to experience. Consequently, the poetry also should try to become more and more comprehensive, more and more elusive, more and more indirect, to create its meaning. And therefore, he says, hence we get something which looks very much like the conceit. We get, in fact, a method curiously similar to that of the metaphysical poets, similar in its use of obscure word and simple phrasing. Eliot is arguing Eliot is arguing that as modern life today is complex, it throws a wide range of experiences at us. Today's poet should use devices like metaphysical conceits and should also be as complex as the complexity of modern life. So in some way, T.S. Eliot is justifying complexity and obscurity of modern poetry. He seems to be actually saying that just because modern life is obscure and complex, modern poetry is also obscure and complex. And he is saying something which is very interesting. He is saying that we modern poets should use something which is similar to metaphysical conceits. So Eliot is trying to establish metaphysical poets as a role model for 20th century poetry, and he succeeded in doing that. And that is the reason why modern poetry is deeply influenced by metaphysical poetry. So as we come to the end of our discussion today, we are going to look at a contemporary poem and how that contemporary poem actually uses metaphysical devices of metaphysical conceits. So let's look at the next slide. And 20th century poetry bears a distinctive impact of metaphysical poetry in its intellectual complexity, far-fetched analogies or metaphysical conceits, and its startling imagery. The poems like A.K. Ramanujan's small-scale reflection on a great house, which probably you are studying in your syllabus, bear the stamp of a typical metaphysical poem. Now, it's possible that your teacher may not have discussed this poem as an example of metaphysical poem, but it's very interesting to see how a poet from India is also in some way revealing his relation to a very distinctive kind of poetic school known as the metaphysical school of poetry in the 17th century Britain. That's very interesting. The difference is in Ramanujan's preoccupation with the day-to-day life as against the abstraction of the metaphysicals. Small-scale reflection on a great house as a metaphysical poem. The poem begins, sometimes I think that nothing ever comes into this house goes out. Things come in every day to lose themselves among other things. Lost long ago among the other things lost long ago. That's how the first stanza, the first few lines of the poems are. And that establishes the conceit. The whole poem is about things which go into the house, which don't go out, and if they go out at all, they come back to the house in a different way. And then he goes on to provide a list of things that come into the house and become part of it. So what are those things? The things include things like lame wandering cows. And also what happens in the libraries. Unread library books usually mature in 2 weeks and begin to lay a row of little eggs in the ledger for fines. As silverfish in the old man's office room breed dynasties among long legal words in the succulents of Victorian parchment. If you look at this stanza, then there is a very striking analogy, comparison between two unlike things and an occult resemblance between the two. And those two things are how the silverfish in the library breed dynasties. Now these are dynasty and silverfish. Silverfish is a very small white colored insect that you see in old books. You must have seen it very often. How they breed dynasties is a very disparate and heterogeneous linking of two ideas from two very different sources. This is a very typical example of a metaphysical conceit. But the entire poem is built around the conceit of how things going out of the room, of the house, and how they come back in a different form. So let's look at the next slide where he talks about the things coming back. Things that come into the house also include neighbors' dishes, phonographs, epilepsies of blood, sons-in-law, women, rising sun. Now if you look at this list, then it's a list of very disparate ideas. To use Johnson's word, heterogeneous ideas which are yoked together with violence. And also anything that goes out will come back, processed, and often with long bill attached, says the speaker in the poem. And then he goes on to say, the speaker in the poem, Ramanujan's poem, goes on to say, and I quote, and ideas behave like rumors. Once casually mentioned somewhere, they come back to the door as prodigies. Prodigies are people who are exceptionally talented. On to prodigal fathers with eyes that vaguely look like our own. Like what uncle said the other day, that every Tullinus we read is some Alexander looted between the malarial rivers. If you look at this stanza, then ideas behaving like rumors, coming back as prodigies to prodigal fathers, is compared again to fathers. So you can see there are various things which are very heterogeneous from various sources, and they are yoked together, they are brought together by violence. Look at the image of malarial rivers. Now if you look at these images in Ramanujan poem, and if you look at the style, then you will see that it is use of metaphysical conceit in a very contemporary way. So let's look at the next slide as we go towards the conclusion of today's discussion. Perhaps the quoted lines are a good description of the metaphysical poetry and ideas contained in it. The ideas that behave like rumors and come back like prodigies born to prodigal fathers. This is indeed a metaphysical conceit. But this metaphysical conceit in Ramanujan's poem can also let us interpret. It's our interpretation that we can use this conceit to talk about metaphysical conceits. These ideas are like rumors. So metaphysical conceit also spread like rumors which cannot be contained, and they come back to the same source from where they have started, but they come back in a different guise. The poem, which is about different thing, right now can be seen as a metaphor for how ideas, literary ideas, like the metaphysical conceit and the metaphysical style, seem to circulate in this world today in 21st century. So this is a very novel interpretation of Ramanujan's poem. So I want actually to conclude this discussion on metaphysical poetry by saying that in the course of our discussion we looked at the term metaphysical poets, we looked at some of the key aspects and some of the important poets who are called metaphysical poets. Then we also saw how metaphysical poetry is important to 20th century poetry and how its influence is still alive. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Sandhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.